Well, welcome. This is the first time that I'll be addressing questions as a bhikkhu on camera. So I wanted to. Actually, this might be the first of a series because I have been asked a series of questions which I haven't had the time to look at and address properly. So I think this would be a good format, a medium for me to be able to do that. So I think the glasses are much better without them, actually. Well, maybe not so much. So the question that I would like to address today is the one related with toxic shame, a sense of guilt that has been raised a few times. So in different settings. So today would be, I think, a good opportunity for me to do to shed some light on it, a Buddhist perspective. I would like to address it in that context, from that angle, because I believe there's been quite a number of research studies and lectures and TED Talks, etc., etc. So this is not going to be adding on to that type of, I guess, input, clarification on this subject of toxic shame, or shame, rather, instead of just calling it toxic shame. Just to recap on what toxic shame involves, it's, first of all, it's a very painful experience that can last a person a whole entire lifetime. And not only that, but it can perpetuate itself and influence the way we sustain our friendships, the way we look at relationships, and whether they're romantic or otherwise, work, professional relationships, and above all, our relationship towards ourselves. So that's one aspect of its negative impact on the individual. In addition, it causes a person to be dishonest towards oneself. And if we are dishonest towards ourselves, you know what's going to happen next. Interpersonal relationships will definitely be damaged, and there's going to be always this sense of a lack of truthfulness, which inevitably leads a person to feel isolated, unheard, and eventually, obviously, the sad, the state of affairs that we call loneliness that will spread throughout the person's life. And unfortunately, it doesn't stay just in that affective atmosphere. It goes ahead and turns into its opposite, meaning it becomes a lot more aggressive. Because if we're lonely, we're sad, there's a sense of powerlessness. That powerlessness lends us to become resentful, and hatred arises. And when we don't have the tools to be heard, to be able to express ourselves from a place of truthfulness and honesty, and we eventually get to a point where the hatred grows into a sense of anger. Interesting what we're seeing in the world today. So it turns into abusive behavior. and from that, abusive relationships, whether towards oneself or others. Abuse doesn't necessarily just have to be dealing with aggressive physical harming someone else. It also manifests often in the form of self-harm, like cutting and eating disorders, all kinds of anorexia nervosa, and all these other things that come in as it's basically the human being trying to make sense of what's happening and dealing with all these emotions. A person might even become a workaholic, so substance abuse could kick in, drugs, sexual addictions come in, all kinds of addictions, and we just fall back whenever we're trying to make sense of it all and call it, well, it's because of my history. It's because of who and what I am. And when we run out of the narratives that we have constantly told ourselves about our past, albeit oftentimes valid, we have the data in our memories. We have the experiences in our bodies, which the body doesn't lie. So the memories are lodged in deep. But even with all that, when we reach a point where we cannot justify it, we just self-implode. And we look for support. We look for some type of care, connection, and a pair of listening ears and a big heart to be able to encapsulate a level of compassion and love, loving kindness, we call it in Buddhism, metta, that would be able to make room for us to share and hopefully learn from that interaction. Now, obviously, the way to deal with toxic shame, I'm not going to be addressing this as a psychotherapist. However, I will be shedding some light on the Buddhist perspective as to how we look at shame. So it will be a different take on shame as a subject, as a reality that people face and have to endure throughout their lives, or parts of their lives at least. So I will be discussing that. Something I mentioned earlier, and that had to do with the honesty part. Honesty. I apologize for the noise in the background. This is the quietest place I could find, and I felt the need for me to get going and start discussing these, or offering my thoughts on such questions that were positive recently. So anyhow, honesty, or the lack of, the dishonesty part. Unfortunately, we are living in a time period where humanity has become accustomed to living our lives in dishonest manners. What do I mean by that? We have become dissociated from ourselves and what it is that we are trying to build the most important relationship with, meaning ourselves. We lose that, we lose everything. Unfortunately, everybody's going outward, away from this center, to be able to find that bit of happiness in that perfect partner, in that perfect situation in the world today, in that perfectly socially just system or world. All these things are outside of ourselves. Meanwhile, there's chaos inside. So we have chaos, but we want harmony outside. And that's the only way that I, as a human being today, am convincing myself that I could be happy. If only my spouse did exactly what I wanted them to do. If only my children did exactly like I did. If only my boss did exactly as I would have liked them to. How realistic is that? So it's not a sense of powerlessness that I'm trying to encourage here. What I'll be trying to do here is bring about the sense of I don't think my eyes are showing well with these transition glasses, so I'll put them away. This sense of shame and guilt. But in Buddhism, we don't have the guilt part as such. We have, well, first of all, we have these two terms that the Buddha introduced. They're called hiri and ottappa. Now, this is totally different way of looking at shame, I have to warn you. Because so far we've been accustomed to thinking looking at shame and thinking it's a bad, negative state. And the way that it has been introduced to us and expressed, defined, absolutely. It's quite toxic, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction part. However, when we look at the Buddha's way of describing it, hiri, for example, hiri is think of it as this sense of wise, moral shame. That's another word that we have pushed away from us, even from the 60s on. And moral, because of what connotations it carries with it. The world, Judeo-Christian world, or we've been raised in, most of us, it's been shoved our throats. It's been, it's very punitive morality when we think of it. It has those feelings attached to them, emotions, and usually associations that are not so good. So understandably, when we talk about morality, we think about it of it as something that we need to stay away from. It has nothing to do with a just, advanced, cultured, civilized world. However, from the perspective of the Dhamma, or Buddha's teachings, Theravada tradition, nothing could be further from the truth as it relates to morality or ethics. In English, I like to use the word virtue. It fits much better, even though I don't have any qualms anymore, because I come from a very strict Christian background. I grew up in that world. I went to Protestant church, etc., and so it's very interesting, colorful past there. But when we're given new information, we must have the responsibility to look at things a little bit more carefully and look at possibly whether we've missed out on a few things and change our worldview, change our narratives, the framework, how we function. So, hiri and ottappa. One can be called wise moral shame or wise virtuous shame, and the other one is wise moral or virtuous dread, or rather consideration / fear. Fear not from someone else, but just something that we feel happening within us in regards to a certain, let's say, thought, word, action that we might be committing in the future. So I think the consideration part, the wording in English, consideration, might fit a little bit better. given the narratives that we use nowadays in the 21st century, especially in the West. So, Hiri and Ottappa. The Buddha talked about these two as the measuring devices to indicate the quality of ethics in a culture, in a society, within humanity. So I have written something here, taken actually, it's from the Anguttara Nikaya, which is the numerical discourses from the Pali Canon, which takes us back to 2,600 years approximately. So in it, it's Book of the Twos, Suttas 7 to 9. And I'm just going to read roughly here bhikkhus, which are the monastics, monks that he was addressing. These two bright qualities protect the world. What two? Wise moral shame and wise moral dread or consideration. If these two bright qualities did not protect the world, I'd like you to think about the word protect here. Protect, instead of something that's imposed upon oneself, from whomever, even from us, perhaps. But the protect part. So if these two bright qualities did not protect the world, there would not be seen here any restraint regarding one's mother, one's aunts, or the wives of one's teachers and other respected people. The world would become promiscuous like goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, dogs and jackals. But because these two bright qualities protect the world, there is seen here now restraint regarding one's mother, aunts, or the wives of one's teachers and other respected people. Interesting. What we have to do is just look outside the window and see whether we are feeling protected. Of course, we can talk about the legal system, we talk about geopolitics, we can talk about the police, we talk about any individual or individuals, entities in powerful positions, and their reactions and their behavior, rather, towards the rest, their subjects, if you will, and whether their subjects are actually feeling protected. But it's not a one-sided thing. My mom used to say, you cannot wash both hands with one hand. So it takes two to tango. We have a similar phrase in English. So what does that have to do with shame? Well, the way we present these two in Buddhism, Buddhist teachers, especially from the Theravada, the oldest school of Buddhism currently today in the world, is through these two qualifiers, Hiri and Ottappa, wise moral shame and wise moral or virtuous consideration or dread. The shame that we look at through these lenses involves a certain, not a powerlessness, which is the case with toxic shame, but the opposite of that. It has an empowering characteristic to it. Because from the beginning, the person looks at a situation. Let's say they are presented with a circumstance. And they can do either A or B or C or whatever. But they have all the leeway, all the possibilities to do one thing that might be acceptable this time period by whoever is around us, and get away with it. Or B, despite all these circumstances, we can say no. Holding oneself to a higher standard than whatever societal structures, frameworks again, we are surrounded by, has a lot to do with applying wise moral shame, the way I understand it. Meaning, I have to answer for it myself, to myself, after the fact. So it's not, as you see, it has nothing to do with the toxicity that we dealt with, toxic shame earlier, where somebody else was debasing us, making us feel very small, crushing our individuality, our creativities, our things that make us who we are, for example, which many of us can just look back and so easily see in primary or elementary school or even younger, how some of us might have been treated by a teacher, a caregiver, whatever. That is not what we're talking about here, again. So there's a sense of power, empowerment here, where the person gets to choose because of a consequence or consequences that would occur if I take these steps. If I choose to do this versus that. So the person here has a say in leading one's life. And remember what I was mentioning about earlier about looking outside of ourselves. If the situation is A versus B, then I'm going to be feeling good or happy. So I need to make sure, for the sake of my happiness and my loved ones, I need to make sure the world does that, does A. Well, good luck. How often are we able to even control our bodies, let alone an outside situation? So it's like always trying to chase our tail like a dog, looking for the impossible. And this is the context by which I meant a sense of powerlessness versus empowerment. That's how I see the word empowerment. It's been overly misused recently, and I know in psychotherapeutic and circles that's quite misused, to say the least. But that's a total different section of a talk deserving of it. So, shame. So, based on whatever I'm trying to offer here, it's a totally different take on the word shame. So shame, from the Buddhist perspective, does not have to be something bad. Shame can actually lead us to live very wholesome, skillful, beautiful lives. But the Buddha made it very clear that he talked about these two bright qualities, remember? One is hiri, or wise moral shame. The other one is ottappa, which is roughly translated wise, virtuous, moral, virtuous, or ethical consideration. Not because there's a set of cameras, CCTVs all over and I'm like being watched. Not because of that only. But if I'm doing this, let's say in hiding, when no one's watching, how would this be impacted had someone else seen it, especially if it's someone that I really, really respect? Perhaps a wiser person, a teacher that we really care about, or care about what they think about us. So someone that is dear to us, somebody that inspires us, how would they respond if they were to come to see that it was us that did this, or discover that we've done X, Y, and Z? Again, if you notice, this fear is not generated because of someone else exercising a sense of aggression or some form of menacing power over us. It's very subtle, but it's very much there. So the fear here, as you see also, it's connected to the first hiri, which is wise moral shame. So if I am doing something that this individual that I aspire to become or am inspired by, so basically I respect so much, if they find out about me doing this, ooh, that's not good. Even though it feels good right now for me to be doing it, perhaps, but had they found out, whoa, no, that's not going to happen. So I'll wait until the helicopter goes by. So when we are becoming cognizant and aware of the gravity of the seriousness of what would entail me doing this now, and then later on what would happen had this individual, whom I respect again, found out about this, then it makes me pull away from dedicating more attention to this. And this is basically, in Buddhism, this is at the crux of practicing ethics or ethical life, or we call it virtuous behavior. In Buddhism we have a term for it, it's beautiful, it's called sila, which is another word for, think of it as taking precepts. Sometimes people think precepts are, by the way, before I elaborate on that, are for a layperson there's 5. I've mentioned in different talks, but basically it goes something like this. I undertake to keep the precept to abstain from killing beings on purpose or harming them on purpose. I undertake the training rule, basically. I'm training myself to keep the precept, to abstain from taking what is not freely given to me. I undertake to keep the precept to abstain from engaging in sexual misconduct, meaning sleeping with someone else's mate, sleeping behind my own mate, sleeping behind or abusing someone sexually, taking advantage of someone sexually, having sex with a prostitute, having sex with someone who is a minor or under someone else's care, against their will, basically, and including sexually abusing one's own body. So somebody's going to get hurt, basically, because of this action. So I'm training myself not to. That's what the person is saying to themselves. Key. The fourth one is I undertake to keep the training rule to abstain from using false speech, tweaking reality to make it sound a certain way so that I can actually get benefits because of that, financial, etc., or using harsh speech, angry curse words or things like that, or slandering, gossiping behind someone. A good rule of thumb is, would I be saying this if this third person who's not here, would I be saying this if they were here about them? So that usually stops us in our tracks. If that's the case, then we were about to slander. So not to do that. And then the other one is in regard to the fourth precept or speech, has to do with idle chatter. Something that today, especially in America, we're known for it. Useless, frivolous speech. Constantly filling up these gaps of silence where we don't have to say anything, but we do, and which depletes us from valuable energy, and we leak out. And then the fifth precept has to do with, it goes something like this: I undertake the training rule to abstain from taking any intoxicants that dull the mind. Because we lose that, we lose everything. Every other precept is broken. So with that in mind, we apply a lifestyle that incorporates some sense of responsibility to ourselves first. So if you noticed, it's all about the person. It's not about someone else. First. Now, of course, a true Buddhist is, to my understanding, and in the life of the Buddha and his disciples, it's clearly obvious how much of activists they were in changing society and its fabric of understanding about human relations. Long before anyone else in the world. We still have a lot to catch up on in the 21st century with all of our protests and all these social justice movements and wanting this or burning that or destroying this. First of all, there needs to be a personal responsibility first. And that's where Sila begins. But it doesn't stop there. The Buddha used 3 trainings. One of them, obviously, the groundwork, the foundation is Sila. Second is Samadhi, which is mental cultivation, meditation, proper meditation. It's not about just relaxing. That's not meditation. It's just one side effect. And it's not just about mindfulness. Mindfulness is just one step in the meditative process, unlike what is being taught today about mindfulness. So because they go hand in hand. You can't be mindful but live a non-virtuous life. It doesn't work. It doesn't. That's not what was the reason behind the Buddha producing, discovering, sharing mindfulness, because before him there were no schools that taught mindfulness the way he did. As such, mindfulness. So it's a uniquely Buddhist introduction. Especially recently, people say that it's been in other places, but it hasn't. But anyhow, that's another topic. Something that I addressed in my dissertation that I've done some time ago. So, Sila, Samadhi. One is ethical lifestyle. The other one is cultivating of the mind. Now, the third one, these two lead up to, happens to be wisdom, discernment. That comes out of living an ethical life. Whose life? The person's life. By taking on the responsibility of oneself. Now, I want to quickly connect this to the earlier interpretation of shame in the modern world. I've been a therapist for some time, and I've seen it quite. I've read on it, I've researched it and lectures and all that, but this is how, shame is always looked at as something derogatory, something negative, something toxic, of course. And as I mentioned, it is in many, many contexts. However, what I'm proposing here is to look at it perhaps indulging ourselves, to look at it from a Buddhist perspective and empowering ourselves for once, instead of looking at this event or these sets of events that have produced continuous series of traumatic experiences for us. I'm a survivor of PTSD, for example, so I've lived through trauma, and I've worked with people with trauma as a psychotherapist, but now as a teacher of the Dhamma, as a practitioner of the Dhamma for many years, I see the correlation, the healing quality that can be brought into a person's life. And that comes in by ownership, by the sense of owning this experience that we're going through, not relinquishing our hand, flailing our arms and saying, oh, I'm doomed, I'm this, and it's happening to me, so I have to take it. No. Remember the empowerment part. So long as we're alive, so long as there's a breath in our lungs, we have the ability to practice hiri and ottappa, to practice wise moral shame, and to practice wise moral or virtuous consideration towards myself and my mental quality, the mental quality of my mind. How is it? How is the quality of my mind? In a recent meditation Q&A session after the retreat, I had one student who was very perplexed, understandably so, about the world situation. And we all want to do something. Of course, that's a natural, empathetic quality, I would say, about the world and how can we help. But if my hands are already dirty, how can I go ahead and fold these clean sheets? The analogy I'm trying to draw to is the same one as the ones that the one that we see every time you get on a plane, and the flight attendant goes and does the routine of showing us how to put on a life jacket, or especially the oxygen mask. They never ever tell us to go ahead and put it on our loved one or the person next to us or the person who's younger than us, a baby even. They always tell us we have to put it on ourselves first. The Buddha said this 2,600 years ago. So there's nothing noble in going outside of ourselves and trying to fix the world before we fix ourselves. And when you think about shame in that way, also our own feelings of hurt, being damaged, if you will, because of some of us have had horrific pasts. But they're where? They're when? Pasts. In our past. So in a way, that also can be considered something outside of me. Meaning, when we say the word outside, that means outside of our control. Life only happens here. Not in the future. And definitely not in the past. It's gone. What I do with what happened to me yesterday, or 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever. What happens when I relate to those experiences now? How I'm relating to them now dictates what happens in the next moment, the rest of my life. And that's the best way to change the world. Because in the midst of this transition, I'm changing my life, the quality, the flavor, the DNA of my life, how I think. The first verse of the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, the mind is the forerunner of all states. He mentions evil states. Mind is the forerunner of all good states, he says. Just like the shadow that never leaves a person when they're standing in front of a source of light. So that is the encouragement that the Buddha gave to us. And by giving us very valid tools, instruments to take charge of our lives. Now, when we look at things, what I just am sharing with you, in the context of the world today, we see how there is, I mentioned about the lack of honesty or dishonesty, the presence of dishonesty, usually towards ourselves and by extension to the world, towards the world, in relation to the world. What that also means is that we have camouflaged reality so much that we have been policing our own words. Now, this is different than exercising wise moral consideration, or wise moral shame, or wise virtuous shame. This is different. This is stemming from a need to be accepted. This is important. Very important. Because I find myself compelled to talk about these other two things that I see a lot in the world today, which cause a situation where there is dishonesty in the world. So by changing the words, by and not only that, sadly, we're punishing those who use certain words. We're punishing those who, we're policing them. Meanwhile, we're against authority figures. We are policing others. I'm waiting for you to say that. If you do, I'm going to put you in a nice little box you're not going to be able to get out of. Wow. So, our version of reality, our version of how we want the world to be, is the acceptable version. When I hear myself say those words, I think of other time periods in human history, or now too, of course, but other time periods that we look upon in, with some sadness, some frustration, some anger, maybe, communist eras, time periods where people didn't have the ability to say, to express themselves. Meanwhile, we today, surprisingly or ironically, claim that we are living a time period where we can say. However, many of us are not giving the opportunity for each other to say things as they are happening in the world. Meaning, people have stopped discussing their emotions properly. We feel them. We feel them. We feel anger, we feel this way or that way, but because if I were to release those words out of my lips, I'm more concerned about the outcome, so I hold on to that and give you a different, totally different word. So there's this dichotomy now all of a sudden. The person ends up being dissociated. Remember early on in the talk I was saying how that we've been dissociated? There's an element of dishonesty. This is what I'm referring to. This is at the core. But where does this come from? This schism that's happening in every single one of us, where we're living untruthful lives. Where one spouse turns to the other and says something that they don't mean, the other one does the same. And this is trickling down to the children. And then we look at the TV or social media, whatever, the news, and they're perpetuating the same thing. So there's a lack of responsibility. Meanwhile, everybody wants to be living in a perfect world. Well, what kind of perfect world are we talking about? Because what I think of a perfect world might not agree with what your version is, etc. And there's about almost 8 billion of us. Good luck finding a coherent version. And everybody's opinion is basically stemming from whatever's being introduced, whether it's through the news agencies, the media, whatever the flavor of the day is. And because the person is already dissociated from oneself, they don't even know what it is that they really want anymore. Because the values have gone down the drain. Why? Because there's a lack of Hiri and Ottappa. There's a major bankruptcy of wise moral shame in today's society. There's a major bankruptcy in the department of wise moral consideration. It's all about me. It's all about me. It's like children. I sometimes jokingly would tell students, or in the past, and my clients and patients, say, today's adults are just children that have not grown past the age of 9 or 11 emotionally, but are occupying adults' bodies. I want this, I want that, I don't want this, and I want all of that. Without taking responsibility. And meanwhile, I'm seeking acceptance. That's the problem. Seeking acceptance. This is the problem as it relates to living a dissociated life, where we want one thing. We might viscerally feel something, but we're doing the opposite because the person is no longer in harmony within themselves. The first of the Eightfold Path is harmonious perspective or right view. We've lost it if we keep on this track. So this is not, doom and gloom type of a talk. This is just a wake-up call, hopefully, to take back our responsibility, which requires a lot of courage, which is on the opposite side of seeking acceptance. Seeking acceptance is also, by the way, something that a person who's experienced toxic shame seeks constantly, because their sense of trust has been torn to bits. They have not had love. They have not had compassion, care. But why do we need to start seeking it out from the outside world? Why can't we just start from here first? And that is the empowering aspect of using Hiri and Ottappa, wise moral shame and wise moral consideration. Morality is not bad if we know what we're talking about. We're bringing forth a healthier version of the world morality, a healthier, constructive, a wonderful description of it through the actions of our bodies, through our speech, the words that come out, and most importantly, the thoughts that we think. There's a helicopter going by. So by moving away from doing whatever we want, adding our own versions to things without having really made them our truths, really felt them, really experienced them, instead of saying, I like to call it regurgitating other people's vomit. because they have not truly digested what is being spoken by them. So many people are just copying other people's copy of other people's copies and assumptions. However, when we are applying, this is what's another wonderful thing about this practice, is that it brings the awareness of our responsibility back to our doorsteps. Individual responsibility, which again is a clear, powerful testament to our courage, which is not begging for acceptance by other people, by giving up, relinquishing my integrity and what I see to be truth based on my study of history, which is another thing which is lacking today. People have no idea about history. We're not looking in front of us, we're looking in the past, which is again something that is reminiscent of toxic shame. When a person is looking back, constantly looking back while their feet are in the present, or into the future while their feet are in the present. And then one day they look and voila, life has passed them by. Just like we have been depleting our water sources environmentally, we've been abusing this beautiful planet. And what happened last year in Australia and other places where water reserves were just like, sold or whatever, not taken care of. This is a life source for all of us. Yeah, we'll think about it. We'll substitute it somehow with something else in the future. That kind of a mindset is so dangerous. And it's so pervasive. It's everywhere. It's not just about our ethics, our virtue, which is lacking. We're bankrupt in that. But we can change that one person at a time, ourselves. But what I'm also noticing this is also we have been taking the use and application and strength of our own intelligence as a species, giving it up so much that we're saying, we'll figure something out in the future. In fact, here's the invention. Here's the clue. The answer to all of this. What? AI, artificial intelligence. Let's create intelligence. Create intelligence. Interesting. Meanwhile, our kids, ourselves too, our brains are becoming more and more minimized in their capacity to process, to understand, to dig deep into situations and to ponder possibilities and see oneself in a responsible, courageous role to make a change in oneself, which requires a strong sense of audacity to take a step into the unknown. However, our fear of, oh my, I might not be accepted if I do this, that. So I'll relinquish this, I'll relinquish that, I'll relinquish this. Just don't touch me. I'll just take me in the crowd. Let me be accepted as well. Societal acknowledgement, which is another form of narcissism, is giving up so much, not just ourselves from our lives, but whoever's coming after us. So I know I'm talking about a lot of stuff, but my goal is to help raise certain questions and ponder possibilities, and then most importantly see our role in that, instead of looking outside of us as, you're a project that I need to do, you're a problem that I need to fix. Here's fine, there's nothing wrong here. No. Everything is here. It all starts here. It all starts here. This path of the Dhamma, the Buddha's teachings, started 2,600 years ago almost, with one person who saw the status quo. He saw suffering, he saw dukkha, but he also saw that people had given up. They relinquished their quest. Even those teachers that he went to, seeking to learn, they had given up. They had reached a certain level of ecstasy or spiritual achievement, but it was not the goal, because they were still subject to greed, hatred, and delusion. And he reached their states as well, in fact, to the point where they themselves said, why don't you come and be the teacher of this school, or at least co-teach with me all this multitude of students. What a great honor. It wasn't for him. It wasn't an honorific title, because his quest, his courage was this person, to seek out and to step into the unknown, because the love in his heart was so amazingly powerful. The curiosity, the audacity to understand and find a solution to this major problem that many people had given up. Everyone had given up in India, and India was the place for spiritual practice. And he did. He thankfully did. He didn't give up. And that's what distinguishes a Buddha from everyone else. Because they reveal the Dhamma. They reveal the Four Noble Truths. They show us the way so that we get to taste. If we follow these steps that he delineated, what a teacher. Every single step of the way. Every tiny little nuance. It's there. If you follow it without changing anything, without adding anything, you will get to taste what I tasted. That's his promise. And it's a deliverable promise. So I will leave you with that, and thank you for listening. I was intending to make this only about 12 to 15 minutes, but I guess it went a little bit over. So I look forward to more sessions like these where I address other questions that may arise. So please be safe. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to go in and to take the responsibility that is yours to take, and to live this life, because no one will breathe for you. No one will eat for you. So please, be kind, be gentle, be forgiving, above all, of yourself, of your past, and feel the comfort, slowly, of occupying your shoes, of being in the present moment. Until next time, may the Triple Gem bless you.